morning people, it is Thursday, week 9, term 3. We'll find out if we get out of lockdown today, and I'm going to do my third video of Past the Shallows. It will be pages 43 to 71. Hope you're having a good day. Bye. Joe was waiting there for him when the boat came in, waiting in the orange van, and when Dad said he could go, Miles ran. Everything you needed was in that van: surfboards, sleeping bags, fishing gear, tools. Miles opened the door and could smell hot chips and gravy. There was a pile left for him in the middle seat, lukewarm and soggy, but still good. "I'm sorry you have to work," Joe said. Miles shrugged. He didn't want to talk about it. Joe drove fast on the raw, dusty gravel, and plumes of it billowed up behind them. Scrub and shacks past the window. Kit homes, mostly tiny, bare fibro and unpainted. Miles knew them all. Their gardens full of rusty car shells, dead tractors, decaying boats marooned on land. And if you didn't know better, you'd think that no one lived here anymore, that all these places were abandoned, but people were in there somewhere, hidden and burrowed in. They were there. The road began to climb, less shacks, more scrub, and on the other side was roaring. Joe stopped the car right on the headland, parked close to the cliff, and Miles looked down at the bluff, down at the reefs. He turned to Joe and smiled. There was swell coming in. It was clean, no wind. They were going in. Miles could get into his wetsuit so fast, even when it was damp and stuck to your skin like glue. You couldn't wait around when surf was good. You couldn't wait around and say, "I'll surf it later," because the wind changed and the tide changed. And just like that, it could go on shore. Just like that, it could get fat with the high tide and you could miss it. He grabbed his board and ran down the steep track to the beach. He left Joe behind, and all the way down his eyes were out on that break. The right-hander that was wrapped tight around the bluff, it was his. He'd get there the first wave. The cold water bit at his hands and feet as he began to paddle. Winter brought massive swells. Awesome to watch and not much fun to be in, but today the bluff was still like liquid mercury. Near perfect 3-foot lines. The paddle was easy and the waves were easy. The ocean was at peace. He sat behind the break, looked back towards the beach. Joe was only just coming down the track, but he was strong. He paddled quick and he'd be out in no time. Miles turned his head to the horizon and grinned. A good-sized line, maybe a 4-footer, hit the reef and began to peel. Sometimes you didn't have to move an inch. The shoulder of the wave lifted his board. He looked down the clean face and took the drop. Miles felt his bones. He carved along the wave nice and loose, flick up with sharp cutbacks every so often to bring him back up onto the shoulder. He heard Joe hooting from the beach and he knew he was charging. Joe and Miles sat together waiting for the last line, and then Joe said he was leaving. Miles sat still. He looked down at the water. It was one solid dark mass, impossible to see past the surface now that the light had gone. "The boat's done. Just got to get a few things sorted, pack up the house. Maybe you could come over and help on the weekend." Joe's boat was finished, the one he had been building all these years. It was ready to sail, ready to take Joe away. "She's a fucking bitch," Miles said. And it was true. Auntie Jean was a bitch. Grandad had left the house to Joe. He had lived with Grandad since he was 13. Auntie Jean stole it from him, contested the will. "You know she's going to put money aside for you and Harry. Anyway, it's not even about the house, really. It's what?" Joe splashed some water on his face and he didn't answer. "It's what?" "Time," Joe said. "It's just time." Everything was dark blue now. The cliffs and the beach and even Joe's face were all blurred and hazy. Miles wanted to tell Joe that things were bad at home. He wanted to tell him that working on the boat was bad and that he didn't know what to do. But he didn't say any of that. He just said he would come and help on the weekend. Come and pack up the shed and the house, because he wanted to stay at Grandad's. He wanted to stay with Joe. "We'd better go in," Joe said. "It's freezing." Miles had started to shiver, but he couldn't really feel it. It was still dark outside, but light was coming in from under the door and Miles was coughing. "Are you sick?" Harry asked. "Shut your eyes for a sec. I've got to turn the light on." Harry closed his eyes tight, but the burst of bright light still made his eyes water. He opened them carefully, held one hand up to shield them. Miles coughed again from somewhere deep, and he had black bags under his eyes. They were puffy. "Are you sick? Maybe you can stay home." If Miles stayed home, they could put a fire on and watch TV, and Harry could make him a cup of soups and lemon drinks. Miles squeezed the jumper over the top of the one he already had on and put his beanie on. "Go back to sleep," he said. "Do you want my scarf?" "I'm okay." The air was cold and Harry was glad he didn't have to get out of bed. He let his body lie back down. Dad called Miles from the lounge. "Maybe you'll get to finish early today," Harry said. Miles was looking for something on the floor. He picked up some socks and slipped them over the ones he was already wearing. "I'd better go." He coughed again and turned the bedroom light off. Harry heard the toaster pop, then the front door shut. Miles had left the lounge light on for Harry, so it wasn't dark. He curled up in his doona, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep now. He was already awake and he was thinking about that dog, the puppy that wanted to play with him, and he knew he was going to go back and look for it. He knew that's what he was going to do. Maybe not today, but soon. They had finished up early. All the tubs were full and their daily quota reached, and they would get back to the wharf by 11. Have the boat cleaned and ready by 12 maybe. Miles was thinking that he'd walk around to Joe's from the wharf and see if he was home, because when the boat had passed Tasman Head, the swell had been running straight out southwest, and if it stayed that way and if the breeze didn't kick up, there'd be good waves at low tide at Lady Bay or on the bluff at Roaring. It would be perfect. Martin poked his head out of the cabin and the engine cut. He'd seen salmon. Miles ran to the side, looked out the back. Atlantic salmon were massing in a giant ball. A feeding frenzy, and they were huge, probably escapees from the salmon cages in Dover. An easy catch. Dad grabbed a rod and cast out. The metal lure only floated for a second before he yanked it back, and a salmon hit the deck with a thud, gills flaring. Miles ran over and grabbed it. The fish fought hard against his hands, but he managed to unhook its jaw and chuck it in a plastic tub. As soon as the line was free, Dad cast it again, and just as quickly there was another fish. Jeff grabbed the rod too, and now fish were flying in every few seconds. Miles scrambled around the deck, unhooking fish and sliding them into the tub. Within minutes, the first tub was full. Miles knelt down and watched the fat salmon writhing, their sharp little teeth trying to find something to bite. Atlantic salmon were vicious little bastards. Martin came over, and with a swift stab to the bottom of the head, he killed the fish one by one. It wasn't cruel if you did it properly, but Miles wasn't very good at it. He always hesitated at the last minute, and he was glad he didn't have to do it today. Martin put his knife down. Something made them both look up. A change in light, a sudden stillness. There was a giant mako in the sky, its mouth closing in on the salmon at the end of Dad's line. Miles tried to stand, tried to move, but Jeff pushed past him and he fell face first onto the wet deck. The whole boat quaked, tipped, and Miles slid until he smashed hard against the railing, and water was coming in or coming over, and when he looked, the ocean was right there, right next to his face. He was pinned, the side of his body numb. He turned his head slowly, and the thick, steel blue skin of the shark was touching his arm, touching his skin. It was squeezing into him, thrashing wildly. The shark was right on him. He felt something grab his leg. It was Martin pulling hard, so hard it hurt. Miles' ribs felt like they were going to cave in. Let everything give way, and there was a sickening crack. Miles waited for the pain. He waited for the air to be sucked out of his chest, but someone else was yelling. Someone else was broken. The shark's tail had hit Martin's legs, and he was down on top of Miles. Now Miles could hardly even move his head. All he could do was watch the shark beside him fight. It was jerking itself back, inch by inch, in the direction it had come. Miles could see the curved teeth that spilled out in every direction, teeth that brushed against his skin, and the shark's eyes was on him now. Full of strength and pride, the eye of a champion, a wolf of the sea. "We're going over." Dad was yelling from the far side of the deck. The boat must have been up on some crazy angle because he seemed to be hanging from the rails. They were going over, tipping over. They were going into the water. They were going to go into the water, in the water. A crack ripped through the air, an explosion that blew his ears apart. The shark began thrashing harder, stronger, and Miles could hardly breathe. No, Martin shouted. He was trying to drag his body up and cover Miles. Don't shoo! Another crack, and someone was laughing. Jeff was laughing. Miles could see the bullet wound oozing from the Mako's head. It shook and jumped, every movement bringing the water closer, and Jeff was closer now, standing right above Miles on a weird angle. He was still laughing when the shark's teeth gnashed across his shins, ripping his skin open. Jeff made a hissing sound, cocked his rifle and fired again. Miles shut his eyes, sure that this bullet would lodge in his head, sure that he was dead now, and he didn't move. But he felt the boat move right itself. He felt all the weight that was crushing him lift away. Someone dragged him to his feet. Dad. He was saying something. It looked like, "You okay?" or "You're okay," but Miles couldn't hear the words. His ears were gone, stuffed full of ringing. He stood there and watched Dad scramble to rescue debris that had flung off the boat. The abs and the semen were gone. The tools and equipment. Almost the whole deck was cleared except for the 10-foot Mako that now took up the whole midsection of the boat. Miles looked down at his arms, his body. That shark hadn't hurt him, not even a scratch. She lay on her side, her blue skin already turning grey, and Miles felt sick as he watched Jeff slice through her white underbelly with ease. Her stomach and insides slid through the blood onto the deck. She was pregnant. Jeff hacked into the full womb and 3 pups spilled out, 2 dead and half eating, the other trying to swim in its mother's blood against the hard surface of the deck. Tiny gills stretched open, black eyes searching. Jeff bent over and stabbed it through the head, grinning as its body came up on the long knife. Still fighting, he chucked it at Miles and laughed as he wiped blood off his face. Miles caught the baby in his arms. It was dead now, black eyes fixed. It was fully formed, more than half a metre long, maybe only days away from being born. It would have survived if Jeff had let it go, let it slide off the back of the boat. It had made it this far, battling its siblings, killing and feeding off them. Waiting, it would have been born strong, ready to hunt, ready to fight. Miles felt the engine through his boots. They were moving, but Jeff was still busy with his prize, busy decapitating her. He hooked the head on a winch and started pulling it up. The grotesque and bloody thing rose, bullet wounds clearly visible, all 3 to the head, the last right between the eyes with a metal rod. Jeff slid the rest of the hacked-up carcass down and off the back of the boat, leaving a trail of blood and flesh in the water for the birds to pick through. Someone whacked into Miles from behind. He turned and Dad was yelling, red in the face and pointing at Martin, who was slumped against the wall of the cabin. Miles was still holding the dead baby shark in his hands, and Dad grabbed it and chucked it over the side. Then he slapped Miles hard in the face. "I can't hear," Miles managed to say or yell, but Dad was just marched him into the cabin and made him take the wheel. Martin looked bad, the sweat on his face, the colour of his skin. The shark had snapped his legs so easily. It was swollen and strangely twisted, that it barely looked attached from the knee down. Miles thought that some of Martin's ribs might be broken too, because of the way he was breathing, shallow and quick, but that could have been just because of the pain. It would take at least 20 minutes to get to Dover, and then another 30 to the hospital at Huonville. Miles prayed that the painkillers would start working soon and that his hearing would come back. He jumped up on the tray of the ute and sat next to Martin, who was propped up in the corner. Dad had carefully put blankets all around him and patted him on the shoulder before getting in the cab. It seemed to Miles that Dad genuinely cared for Martin. There was something between them, something that went back a long way. The ute choked into life. Miles' hearing was coming back in waves. He watched Jeff walk across the road to the pub and was glad he wasn't coming to the hospital. Martin was still sweating, still pale. "Not long now," Miles said, still unsure of the volume of his voice. Martin attempted a smile and gestured for Miles to come closer. Miles was careful not to touch Martin's leg as he moved. "Your dad's gonna need you," he said, and suddenly Miles knew what the busted leg meant. He wouldn't be going to school next term. He'd be out on that boat with Dad and with Jeff until Martin could come back. He'd be stuck out there every day. "Watch Jeff. I've tried telling you, Dad, but..." Martin broke off. He rested his head against the cab of the ute. Miles sat back too and watched the white lines of the road snake out from under the tray. He watched it get further and further away, the fishing boats and over, the smoke from the cannery. He watched until they were gone from sight and there was nothing but the road and the green grass and the marshy Huon River flowing slowly. An elderly nurse ushered Miles down the corridor into a small office as the orderlies moved Martin from the ute. She pushed him down onto the low office chair in front of an electric bar heater and said she'd be back in a minute. Miles watched her waddle off down the corridor and disappear. Huonville Hospital was small, made out of the same yellow brick and big steel frame windows as Dover High, except the hospital was only one story, a flat rectangle with a car park. Miles had been here when he was brand new, when it smelled of paint and lino, and he thought it was lucky there was a hospital so close when Grandad was sick. It meant it was easy to come and visit, but it hadn't been easy. He'd only gone once. Grandad was on his side, all bony and yellow with tubes in his arms and a mask covering most of his face. He was crumpled like a sheet of old newspaper, and the room was full of gurgling, each breath slow and full of fluid. Grandad was drowning on the inside, and Miles just stood at the door like a coward. He should have walked over, should have held his hand, but he didn't. He ran down the corridor and out to the car park, and he told Dad that Grandad was asleep and that the nurse had told him to come back tomorrow. When they got home, Joe phoned to say that Grandad had died. "It's all right, your friend's going to be fine, just a broken leg." The nurse had an arm around his shoulder, and Miles realised that his gumboots were red hot from the electric heater. He wiped his cheeks. "It's probably just a shock. Here, I brought you some tea." But Miles didn't have time to drink it because Dad came and found him and said that they were going. Harry found the bushes where he had first seen the dog, and he stood there hidden from the road. He called out, "Here, boy," quietly, and waited, but the dog didn't come. If only he knew the dog's name, then maybe it would come back and they could play here by the road. Harry could even take the dog home for a while and give it some milk or something to eat. Dad wouldn't know. He called out again, louder this time, and looked into the scrub. You couldn't see George's house or even his front paddock from here. You could only see trees. Maybe he'd be safe if he stayed behind the line of trees. If he saw George, he could run. George was big and all hunched over, so he probably wouldn't be able to run fast. Not like Harry could. He'd just walk a little way just to see if he could find the dog. There was a track, a kind of path that he hadn't noticed before. It was muddy and slippery with leaves, and Harry was glad he'd worn his gumboots and not his sneakers. There were probably leeches here. He walked slowly and he kept on listening. He looked up. Some of the eucalypts were really tall, straight and tall and full at the top, blocking out the sky. He heard sticks and branches crack, but he knew that sound. It was always there if he listened, always there in the distance, even when there was no wind. It was the sound of the wattle cracking. The sound of the wattle dropping branches into the river, and upstream on tight bends and narrow channels there were so many branches that they almost dammed the water. They almost choked it, but downstream the current was strong. The water just swallowed the sticks and branches and flushed them out to sea. Harry turned a corner and suddenly he could see it, a paddock and the shack. He reached the end of the trees. He crouched down. He couldn't see George, but the dog was there. It was lying flat on the veranda, in a small patch of sunlight that had broken through the clouds. It looked like it was fast asleep. Harry stayed still and watched the dog. He wanted to sit down because his legs were hurting, and it felt like maybe they were going to sleep. But when he touched the ground with his hands, it was wet here too. He'd just have to stay crouching. The dog really was asleep. It hadn't moved at all, not even its tail or ears. Maybe Harry should go and come back later. But then the dog raised its head. There was a creak of a spring and the door of the shack opened. Harry held his breath and stayed perfectly still as George stepped out onto the veranda. His bent legs were burning, but he didn't flinch. He didn't move. George had something in his hand, a toolbox, and he put it down on the veranda. Then he turned and went back inside. It was Harry's chance to get away. He stood up, held onto a tree to steady himself. He was sure he hadn't made a sound, but when he looked, the dog was standing, its ears up, face pointing right at Harry, and then it barked. Harry pushed his body flat against the tree. He'd wanted to run, but his legs were asleep. They were just dead weights hanging, and they wouldn't work and wouldn't move. He pushed his face into the bark. He closed his eyes and tried to be invisible. Maybe the dog hadn't seen him. Maybe it was barking at a bird or a rabbit or a snake. But there was another bark, and it was close. Harry looked up and he saw the dog running. He swung around and the dog was already at his feet, jumping and whining and clawing at his legs. Harry searched wildly, but George hadn't followed. He was standing outside the shack. Harry could feel the blood moving in his legs again, and they were coming back to life, and he could sprint away now. But he just kept looking at the wooden shack and then back at the dog. And the dog's blue eyes were gleaming and its tail was wagging, and it started to pull at the sleeve of his jacket. Harry let the dog pull. He let the dog pull him away from the safety of the trees, and he moved step by step down the muddy paddock. He moved step by step closer to the shack, because there was nowhere else to go and nothing to do, and because the dog wanted him to stay. When he got down to the veranda near George, the dog became still. It sat down. Harry rubbed his head, scratched behind its ears. He tried not to look at George's face. "I like your dog," he said quietly. George seemed to have trouble speaking, the way his mouth was all open and had a big hole at the top, but Harry could hear the words. He could hear that the dog's name was Jake and that he was 6 months old. "I'm Harry," he said, and George nodded. It looked like maybe he was smiling. George walked to the door and he waved for Harry to follow before he went inside. The wooden door spring closed behind him. There was smoke coming from the chimney, and it was probably really warm inside. Harry had forgotten his gloves and his ears were cold. He dug his hands into Jake's brown fur, but the dog kept moving. It just wanted to play. Harry stood up. He stepped onto the small veranda, stood in front of the door. He wished he could see inside without having to open the door. There could be anything in there, anything waiting for him. It could be a trap, and no one would know he was here. He took a deep breath and reached out for the door handle. The door creaked open. Harry looked into the darkened room. George was standing by a table pouring hot water into the teapot. Jake pushed between Harry's legs and went inside. Harry felt warm air on his face, and he followed. George pulled out a chair and Harry sat down. He looked at the table, watched George's big strange hands put milk and 2 sugars in each cup before he poured the tea. It was exactly how Harry had his tea, milk and 2 sugars. He looked up into George's face, but he wasn't looking at Harry. He was looking down at the cups as he stirred the tea with a spoon. He slid a cup over to Harry. "Thanks," Harry said, and he took the cup in his hands. George sat down. From outside, this place looked just like a picker's hut, all weathered up and grey, but inside was bright and neat and clean, and Harry thought it was nicer than where he lived, nicer than the Brown house, even though it was just one room and there was only a sink instead of a bathroom, and the toilet must be outside somewhere down the back. There was even fresh flowers in a vase, white flowers, lilies. Harry drank his tea quickly because he didn't know what else to do. He didn't know what to say, and he was glad when Jake came over and put his head on Harry's lap. He patted Jake's head and then he started talking. He told George that he really loved dogs and that he wished he could have one at home. But Dad wouldn't let him because he hated dogs. He told George that Miles wanted a dog too, and that he wished Miles didn't have to work out on the boat because he didn't like being on his own all school holidays, and he couldn't go to Joe's because Joe was busy, because he had to pack up Grandad's house and everything. And then he asked George if he had known Grandad, and George nodded, and Harry thought he would have because back then everybody knew everyone around here. That's what Grandad had told him anyway. George didn't say much, but he seemed to be listening. He seemed to understand what Harry was talking about. Harry asked him where he got Jake, and he waited for George to answer. George poured them both another cup of tea, stirred the milk and sugar in like before, and then he took a sip. He said that he found Jake on the road near Darrell Jarrett's place, and that he was skinny and sick, and that he was almost dead. Harry knew exactly how Darrell Jarrett's dogs lived. They were wild, spent their lives on the end of a chain, frothing at the mouth and whining and barking and looking like they might want to kill something, looking like they might want to die. he'd seen them once from behind the windshield of Dad's ute. Eyes red and full, spit dripping from their barking mouths as Daryl chucked a bucket of rotten scraps on the ground. Dad had gone up there to buy a chainsaw. He'd said that Daryl was desperate, selling everything, even his car. It was all as cheap as you liked, and Dad had laughed about the chainsaw when they got home because he didn't even need one. He'd already owned a better one. He said he would sell Daryl's chainsaw for twice what he paid for it. Bloody fool, he said. Harry never went anywhere near the place again. Even though they were almost neighbours, he never went anywhere near that red metal sign on a chain that hung over the bottom of the driveway, big letters painted in white, private property. Harry looked down at Jake. He was lying on the floor now, and Harry stroked down his body, patted his warm stomach. The dog's eyes fell heavy and then they closed, and he was asleep just like that, asleep with his head resting on Harry's foot. Jake was lucky. George had saved him. George put his cup down on the table and stretched his arms out by his sides. Harry didn't know what time it was. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there. His foot had started to go to sleep again under Jake's head, and he lifted his leg gently off the ground. Jake woke and got to his feet. Then he curved back into a big stretch, yawned. He looked at Harry. "I'd better go," Harry said. George stood up and they walked out onto the veranda. The cold air hit Harry's face hard, and he zipped up his parka. George picked up the toolbox that was still on the veranda. He said he had to go and make some repairs to his jetty down the back. He said Harry could come if he wanted. "I'd better go," Harry said again, even though he didn't really have to. He stepped off the veranda, but then he stopped. He turned back to George. "I might come back again though," he said. "Another day." George nodded, and Harry watched him walk away with Jake following close behind him. And that's where we will stop today. Bye.